Thank you very much, Belinda. Much appreciated. So as Belinda said, essentially I've got a kind of raft of questions here that I kind of pre-prep the panel on. But as with all these things, normally I ask a couple of questions and about another 100 come into my head. I am from the content side, trained journalist from local newspapers through to magazines now. So I'm very content stooped and steeped in content things. But I'm happy and love you all to be involved in terms of asking questions. I will scan the room. I'll keep an eye out for you. Hand, shout, throw something at me. I'll try and look up and put forward your question. As I came up in the lift, actually, someone said to me, this is going to be fun for you. Everyone's got something to say here. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. Luckily, we've got an hour. The reason for the microphones, just to put everyone at ease, is purely because for M&M Global, we want to create a little piece of video content, essentially. So it's nothing bad. It's just to showcase, some of the leaders in content around the country, around the globe, what they know and what they want to do about content and what they think. So without further ado, because I'll be talking a lot, I don't wish to go on all day, I'll start here. We've got Jerry Daykin, who is the Digital Director, Global Digital Director over at Dentsu Aegis Netowrk. Next to him, we have the lovely Jackie Hunter, who is the editor of the Wall Street Journal Custom Studios. And then finally here, I saved this one to last because I just like the job title. It's the boss of Amice Lock Consulting, and this is Amice Lock.
/ only employee, but that's fine.
But it was a good job title, I felt. So I figure for us, really, the kind of first place to start, and I'll ask the three experts here to my right and left. In terms of content, as Belinda says, everyone is talking about content. Is in some places, content is king, potentially context is God. Why suddenly now? I mean, we've all worked in content all our lives. Why suddenly now our brands, our agencies, everyone in our kind of media spectrum talking about content as if it's this brand new piece or idea that's only just come onto the table? What is the real reasoning for this kind of rise up the chart, if you like? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Fire away,
So I started off as a planner within agencies and then moved onto the content side. And I think it's one of those sort of age-old things that content, and I think as Belinda was saying, journalism, as many would still call it, if it's got true integrity and value, has kind of been around sort of forever. So I think actually it's technology that really has, in one sense, sort of driven, because it's facilitated the distribution of content, or longer form content as we would think of it now. And I think the less traction that brands have been able to get through paid for media, the more there's a need to try to engage with something else that tells their brand story, but that arguably has more value or benefit to the audience. And I think that's where content kind of fills that gap, and in its many guises to do that. So it kind of bridges the ability to be able to tell your story and brand story or product story, whatever that might be, but in a way, if it's cleverly done with the right support and backing, that actually has a real benefit and value to the end consumer. So that's, I think, has caused a kind of upsurge, and then everyone wants to be on the cusp of something that feels like it's new.
Interesting. Is that something that you guys agree with from your point of view in particular?
I would agree with that, yes, because we're an independent, sort of if you like, a small creative agency that operates within the Wall Street Journal for the EMEA edition. And yes, so our clients are looking for different ways to connect with our audience. And Amice is right about technology having enabled that and encouraged that. We can be more interactive with brands. We can feel as though we are a part of their story, that we have some influence on them. And there are so many more platforms on which clients and brands can connect. Consumers and brands can connect. So I think it's just some of those sort of self-perpetuating things. The more platforms there are in which brands can convene with their customer base, the more content we're going to see created.
There's a lot more pipes to fill with content these. I mean, so I work with a range of different brands, but the one I mainly work with is Mondelez, which is Quaff, which is Cadbury and Oreo. And I think the brand marketers at Cadbury, for instance, would say they've been making content, they've been making brand stories for decades. It's nothing new for them, but 10 years ago they only had to create one story. It was a 90-second advert and it was a guerrilla drumming, and it did the trick. Nowadays they've got an awful lot of channels. Technology has opened up hundreds of different ways that consumers are experiencing content. They can't just throw an advert on TV and hope everyone's going to see it. They have to find out, if if you're not even watching TV, how do I get in front of you? And then maybe their TV ad is no longer the right piece of content to put in front of that, which is why they're turning more and more to people who have been making longer form or different content for years, because they haven't got that experience and very interested in native content and partnerships. So just a lot more pipes to fill, I think.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point in itself. A lot more pipes to fill. So it's, actually generating the right content in there, because if you've got more pipes to fill, you've inevitably got more content coming at you from all sides. So I suppose one of the big questions is, how do you create and curate that content that is going to resonate with the consumer? Because that consumer is obviously ever evolving, is way ahead of where we could possibly get as an industry. But in terms of doing our best to keep up with it, where do we and how do we do that?
And I'd say it's particularly hard work for kind of a lot of the brand managers we work with. Their job is everything in their product, from innovation to cutting their costs to getting it in Tesco. So kind of the comms part of it becomes 10-20% of their job, and the idea that person can possibly be entirely over the ecosystem and what their consumers want and everything is a bit mind-blowing. So they do outsource to agencies and partners, and if they can find an editorial team who spends their days creating content that people want and twist that to making content for their consumers, that is a load off their heads, I think.
I think that's the biggest challenge, is making sure that just because technology has allowed us to distribute broader types of content to more audiences, we don't end up in the land of the infomercials. So just because you can, you shouldn't. And if you look at some of the brands that are really leading the way, actually in a B2B sphere, you know, either American Express or Shell, they have dedicated teams that all come from editorial backgrounds, and they view it very much as a purist kind of editorial play, that they interweave the brand message within that, rather than starting out from the brand and then how do you do it. And I think that's the biggest shift, and where I used to work and what I kind of do now is that the biggest difference is being able to align those two worlds. So very often, in the case of the Cadbury marketeer, they will know their brand inside out. They will know their consumer and their interaction with that product inside out. But if you take that average mum, in that instance perhaps, what actually are her broader cares, hopes, fears? What are those things that she's passionate about? Let's start from that kind of premise and then work out where the brand fits in, not as we have done historically and as conventional advertising does, which is go, here's what we want to tell you about our product, now let's try and find a hook that might kind of grab your attention.
And I suppose one of the things on that is, you've all touched on it here, is that kind of editorial commercial line, making sure the brand, editorial. How do you get the buy-in of the editorial teams?
We are an editorial team. I think that the way that we approach it is that we make sure, yes, we can do anything and everything for our clients. We can make video, we can create animated infographics, we can have articles online and print, whatever. But the point is to find the right solution. You can throw everything, all the tools in your toolkit at a client's campaign, but the point is to have that conversation, to listen to the client, to identify what's needed, who they're trying to target, on what platform, for how long, everything, all those factors, and then we can start. Then we create the right campaign in the right landscape for that client. For example, if we have a sort of multimedia campaign with Zurich Insurance Group, where we're creating series of documentary video, articles, infographics. And then for another client such as Dassault Systems, is a very simple year-long series of regular posts on their sort of private invitation-only LinkedIn group. So it's that's a much sort of tighter forum, but it works because we pinpoint the right platform for that client, and I think that's the thing. It's not just to throw all the bells and whistles at it, but to really come up with a solution that works, that engages their target audience.
That's interesting from a platform's point of view, obviously, and actually distributing that content. What are the kind of key trends do you think you've seen at the moment, or from a global perspective? I know obviously every client is different, every campaign is different, but sometimes you see a particular trend. We've seen a lot of, particularly in the sports world, of Periscope being used by various presenters, but you've obviously got a whole privacy issue around that kind of real-time video content. They obviously haven't come to the fore yet, but I'm sure we're only around the corner from that. I know that's obviously one trend. What are the other kind of key distribution trends you're seeing a lot of?
Video is everywhere. That's video is growing massively. Everybody seems to want video, but also, we're looking at as well sort of having to, for example, the the elusive millennial audience, the under 35s. What we found is that we have to go to where they are. They're not, the Wall Street Journal has a fantastic reputation, but the under 35s, tomorrow's decision makers, are not necessarily going to come to us based on our reputation all the time. So we find we have to inhabit Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, to go where they are, to make an impact on them. So that's certainly part of the trend.
I think the video is a really interesting one, just to the first point we made about there being a lot of new pipes to fill, and video in some ways is an answer to that, because video is a thing that fills a lot of those pipes. Like you might have a Facebook page and a Twitter page and a partnership with the Wall Street Journal, and that same video could flow through a lot of those. So we see a lot of our clients kind of pushing for that space, but I don't think video is as simple as that, because the video that's appropriate for a Wall Street Journal article might not be the same video you want to show someone whilst they're scrolling through their newsfeed on Facebook. Well, it might be, but there's a lot of nuances, and I think it's kind of easy for marketers to be like, oh yeah, online video is the answer, but I think that's just opens another can of worms, but an exciting can of worms to work through.
I think it's very easy to be quite lazy, inverted commas, by developing one suite of assets that you try to use universally. And actually, the cleverest thing is to make something fit for purpose. So once you've worked out, okay, what's the audience insight, what's the value to them, what type of content can we create, and for these different platforms, what's the most appropriate way of delivering that gives it the most engagement. So actually, if you look at something that GE have done, and I think they've been a brilliant case study actually of a massive brand, that had very little kind of consumer traction, and they've really reinvented themselves through their content strategy and actually trying to drive reevaluation, reappraisal of their brand within a millennial audience. Again, that tricky one to pin down. But the way in which they have therefore kind of told their story, so they've curated a lot of interesting stuff on Pinterest. They did something called like massive machines. But they look amazing. So they're going right, if we're on Pinterest, that's all highly visual, then we need, or Instagram, it needs to look beautiful and be really, cool and quirky. Then on Vine, they did something, because they're trying to make science kind of cool, so they did really brilliant videos called, 6 seconds of science on Vine. So they've been very specific about going, right, if these are the right platforms and the places that we need to be, how do we best tell our story on that platform? And I think there is a real danger, an interesting brand that will go against what I'm about to say, but I think it is identifying that there are lots of new, ever-evolving different ways of distributing that content, and they're not always appropriate for your brand or your story, so you shouldn't just try it because. One that goes against the curve with that is Burberry, and their absolute commitment to trialling anything, whether it actually kind of works or doesn't really work. They have so put innovation at the heart of their whole brand, obviously not just the way that they produce their product. I think actually they can kind of get away with it, because one of the other things I think is a big theme almost to take out of this is it is a bit of a new world. Technology is evolving all of the time, and actually having the confidence to experiment is an important thing to do. So on one hand, don't do it just because you can, but on the other hand, don't not do it just because it's new and it hasn't been done before.
There's a few interesting points actually came out of that. I think one is that obviously don't do it just for the sake of doing it, which is great advice. How do you, on these different platforms, these different things, how do you actually measure the ROI on that? How do you know if it's been a success? In certain ways, it's very easy to say, oh, we've got 25 readers here, we've got 1,000 views here. Is that one of the issues in convincing brands that they should be going down the kind of new technology routes, in terms of you can't actually see a real measurement? Is that right? Is that wrong? I don't think. I'm just throwing that out there.
I mean, it's definitely a challenge, because brands want to see years and years of evidence and proof that something works, and for TV we kind of have that. Though how accurate all that is, it's hard to say. And I think for a lot of digital channels, especially, and I guess we'll comment this in a while, when the scale at which digital channels operate tends to be quite small, not necessarily through the need of a digital channel, but through the marketer's willingness to commit to them. Like, digital channels can be huge and as big as TV, but budgets tend to be a lot smaller. So it becomes very tricky to kind of, we run a £5 million TV campaign in the UK, and then we throw £100,000 into a bit of online content. It becomes very tricky to work out what that small budget has done, but I mean, not impossible. Obviously, some brands have very direct loops you can see immediately. Something like Cadbury, you have to go into a supermarket and buy it, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. Though you can take club card data and compare it to what you did on Facebook and see who bought stuff. So there are slightly scary ways to close that loop.
I think taking a step back, often it's being really clear up front about what the business objectives are and exactly why you've developed whatever your content strategy is, and therefore making sure that you've got the right measures in place and you're being realistic about that. So often, especially if you're trying to do, in the GE example, actually what they were trying to do is not suddenly get loads of millennials really quickly rushing to the shops to buy some more of their products. Actually what they had to do was to really change people's attitude. So that was a much longer term shift that they needed to do. So they looked at different types of measures to demonstrate the effectiveness of that kind of activity. So how much people wanted to share with it, how much they were engaging with that, what kind of comments people were making on the back of the content that they'd seen. And those sort of attitudinal shifts will be much longer term, but it's about brand building. So I think, again, it's not looking at content as one huge kind of mass of something. It's been quite distinct that within any content strategy there will be lots of different types of content that you're generating, and each with quite a different purpose. And it's ensuring that you've got the right measures along the way to kind of go, right, okay, so this was about our brand building in the same way that we might have used longer form TV advertising or cinema, you know, in the day, and still might. But clearly content communicated over digital platforms can be equally, if not more effective at doing that. But again, you wouldn't have expected a cinema campaign to really shift things overnight, so you shouldn't expect that of a content campaign. But there will be elements, and you know, Facebook is evolving all the time in terms of what you can do and how they fuse kind of content and commerce, so that user journey and customer journey to purchase becomes ever shorter. So I think there are different ways of then stimulating and understanding that, but it's making sure from the outset you're clear on what you want it to do, and that as much as possible you're kind of tracking everything, and that you are prepared to understand that you're going to fail, that some things aren't going to work, but that doesn't matter. That was really valuable learning to build on for what you do next.
And for a media title, obviously the demographic is key. You know, the brands that are with us, with Netowrk and with Dassault Systems and with HSBC, other financial players, and the big businesses, the global corporates. That's obviously that they want to target our readership. You know, the Wall Street Journal reader is, I guess, something that everybody can sort of immediately imagine the sort of the interest that's there.
Yeah, I suppose
it's a different perspective. So although we do use metrics, and you know, obviously that's a very important part of measuring success, but it's also, you know, people will come to us for different reasons to create content because they know our readership and they want to connect with them.
And that's an interesting point, and we've touched slightly on it before, was the trust and authenticity. In terms of, you have all of these channels you go to, and we talked about millennials as well. You know, we know how they're constantly moving, habits are changing. I suppose one of the keys there is how important is trust and authenticity in the platforms where the content is being delivered, as opposed to how that content is being delivered. So I suppose if you have a BuzzFeed or a Mashable up against a Wall Street Journal or a Guardian, say, from a digital perspective, how do you create your content, I suppose? And you've got this trust with the established brands over here, but actually sometimes the millennials just want content for content's sake. So I suppose, what's the key to bringing those consumers into your neck of the woods, if you like, or your kind of brands, the established brands?
Well, the people who want content for content's sake, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, we don't do that because we always sit down with our clients and, you know, just and we ask, what is the problem that you need us to solve? That's the starting point for us. And we'll have that conversation, and sometimes, you know, custom content might not be the answer. It might be a different solution. It might be a marketing solution. They might just need some sort of traffic drivers or whatever. But normally we will come down to a solution that works for them. So we don't do content for content's sake.
And have you found that from a kind of consulting and agency point of view, have you found brands in terms of where they want that content? Are they set on going into particular places, or do they just want it distributed in a particular manner as opposed to where it's placed?
I guess it does matter to some extent where. A lot of people, they just want to make sure that the right people see. So as long as wherever it is has the right audience. That doesn't matter to them. I think kind of to the question before almost about whether that audience, especially like millennials, how important trust is to them. I think it's absolutely very important, kind of the authenticity, but I think their trust can be earned to some extent quite easily, and I think they trust things in a way that we don't quite understand always. Like I think millennials are very open to kind of sponsored content and understanding that a brand has paid for something to be there, and they don't seem to question that I have a problem with it as long as you're upfront about it. I think if you try and sneak something in and it's like their favourite YouTuber just casually pretending that they're using like this new product, they get really affronted. But if their YouTuber's like, hey, you know, someone sent me this new thing to try, they're quite open to that. So I think they're open to the kind of the realities of the world in a way that sometimes when we approach kind of like partnerships and content, we're a bit like, oh, you know, will we offend people? Will they completely discount this because it's branded? I think they're more open to that authentic fakeness.
Yeah, I think it depends a bit on the audience, and we're now in a world of kind of an absolute overflow of content. So there is no shortage, that's for sure. And there is a danger. I mean, if I had £1 for every time I've sat in a briefing, which is we want to be really disruptive and we want, you know, yes, of course, yeah, media first, and that they want, you know, an immediacy. We want a viral. We want it to go global within a minute. And you're like, great, but then it's forgotten the next minute because someone else has done exactly what you've just done. So it's very, very disposable. So there is a sense that, and this is where I think media brands really come into play, that, and certainly for certain audiences that will differ, but if you're looking at kind of C-suite target audience who have very little time, actually for them to dedicate time to something, it's almost like, right, do the job for them, because that's their most precious commodity is their time. So you need to be that beacon, and that's where I think, you know, media, strong media brands really come in to kind of go, right, we've done that job for you, we have curated this content, we've refined it and we've developed it. It's going to be the kind of opinion that you will value, get, grasp, it's of real use to you with thought leaders in this area. And I think that is really important. It doesn't matter that it might have been funded by or facilitated by a brand. If it's got value, it's got value, and I think almost any audience will appreciate that. And there's been lots of research done that I think kind of helps to demonstrate that, again, exactly as Jerry was saying, as long as you're sort of upfront and not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes about it. But generally it's kind of win-win. And if you look back to the kind of old film analogy about how those partnerships were funded, it was like, right, and I remember having this conversation, I'm now going to sound like, hey, in LA, baby, but with Heineken and James Bond. So the parallel being that was kind of like, right, Sam Mendes wanted to do this unbelievable, super amazing opening scene, and the producers were like, yeah, but that's our 95% of our budget's gone in the first kind of 5-10 minutes, so disaster for us. He was like, yeah, but it's going to be amazing. And then we were having these conversations about kind of Heineken and then wanting to have sort of product placement and integration within the movie. And it was kind of like, okay, well, if you allow them to do that, but you still preserve the integrity of the movie, by the way, you can then afford your opening scene plus more. And that's kind of win-win, because audiences then go, okay, actually there was a beer bottle in there, a few might have gone, what, he drank beer or held a beer bottle? But overall, they kind of came out going, what an amazing opening sequence, that was unbelievable. So at the back of my mind, if you can kind of always keep that sort of a parallel or analogy kind of in place, that as long as you're not compromising the end quality and it's actually better for audiences, then, and it's not inauthentic in its placement or in its involvement, then actually, you know, all to the good.
Yeah. And quality is key, that's the point, I think, because our content is on the Wall Street Journal platform, whether that's in print or on our website, or whether it's some co-branded content. The point is that the quality of that content has to at least match the standard of the writing and design and editing in the paper itself. That's what our audience expects. That's the level of quality that they require, and we rise to that.
Yeah, and I suppose that's quite interesting, isn't it? Measuring that and creating that quality, some of the creation of it. Everyone thinks they're kind of a content producer now, don't they? And I suppose one of the key things that would be great to kind of discuss a bit further is, you know, who are the actual kind of the kings of content, if you like who is a producer? Everyone says they're a content producer now, but who should people really trust and who should people really kind of understand?
Well, I think that's where media brands themselves come in, and the quality of their own editorial. But again, so sometimes taking a step back, when you're sort of designing what your content strategy should look like, and I often refer back to John Reith, one of the founding fathers of the BBC, but said that content should really perform one of three roles, so either entertains, informs, or educates. And I think actually if you keep that kind of premise at the back of your mind, you then kind of go, right, actually, if we're trying to generate some really entertaining content, well, who are the people for our target audience who make that? So if it's children, you might kind of go, well, that's Disney, isn't it? You know, or Pixar, or some of these brilliant kind of animators who are really making it magical world for children. Actually, if it's all about kind of information and your target audience is C-suite, you know, CFOs, for example, then it's going to be a quite different set of thought leaders and content generators who are developing that kind of content that's of most valuable to them, and indeed in terms of education. And that's where I think it comes back also, one of the many cliched terms that I'll try and use today, but is a whole kind of brand newsroom. And again, actually, there isn't, thank goodness, anyone here from Heineken today, but a good Heineken example was they wanted to do the story of beer. And I was like, great, that's actually quite interesting. Could be really interesting. And then they went, yeah, on our website we've got all of this stuff. And it literally, for what could have been quite an interesting story, was probably the dullest thing that I've ever, and I couldn't even plough through it, and I was being paid to plough through it. So again, we had to kind of say to them, right, just because you have that information, why, if I'm, and the purpose in that instance was to get young guys to realise that actually beer wasn't as bad for you as you thought it was. So I'm like, right, if that's the premise, don't make them have to wade through this really turgid kind of text to tell them that. Kind of think about how you might bring that to life in a different, more engaging way. That said, I think if you look at it in those kind of three pillars of entertaining, informing, and educating, brands are best placed to do a lot of that kind of education. Again, you kind of ask often why brands bother to have websites. It goes back to, I think, what we've all been saying about where consumers actually go to seek out that content. Very few, unless it's quite functional content, will want to go to a brand's website. But actually, brands are quite good at telling people in the education thing about their products and what they are, that kind of best practice, I suppose, and that becomes a hygiene factor. But they're not necessarily so good in the either entertain realm, or again, depending on what that information might be, giving broader information on whatever that subject is. So I think you have to look at it sort of in a step-by-step.
Yeah, that's true. There are a lot of brands. They have their great websites. They might have brand journalists, but it's again, who's going to look at it? Does somebody who likes drinking beer think, I'll sit down at that website?
I'm going to go to the Heineken website just before I have a pint.
So again, that's it might be another reason for which a client will come to us and say, look, we've got all this information, we've got all these assets, this brand journalism, but we don't think anyone's seeing it. So again, it's for us to sort of edit and curate and take the best of that and say, our readership, our audience is interested in this, and this is a sort of channel. We can be that conduit for the information to reach their target audience.
And how open have brands been to that? Obviously, they're going to come to you and go, wow, we've got this amazing story. We want to tell about the world of beer and how beer was created, and that somehow it's good for you. But how do you kind of deal with those brands and say, actually, this is what you should be doing, this is how you should be doing it, and I suppose how open are they to taking risks with their budget, particularly on a content perspective?
That's exactly what we do, because they've already created, had the content created, they own it, but it's not getting seen. So the answer is that you come to your trusted media brand, or you go wherever you want people to be looking at that, and we come up with a solution. They know we're a creative team. And we can look at their content, see what they've got, and shape it in the right way and deliver it to our audience. So it's if they've invested the time and money in creating that content, they want it to do something for them.
I think it pushes them definitely out of their comfort zone. So in terms of, we've said a couple of times, brand owners know and love and care passionately about their brands, and when you kind of do that kind of sponsored content, inevitably you're giving some of that over. You don't give your brand to the Wall Street Journal to create a Cadbury advert. You give it to create a Wall Street Journal approach to yours. Or I've seen a great response from that National Geographic on a Cadbury brief they had around some of their kind of fair trade CSR stuff, and you can see the brand manager squirming a little bit inside, because they're like, why isn't this saying free the joy and ticking these, why isn't there more purple and things? and it's pushing them outside of their very kind of well drilled in constructs in their head. You know, there's no use going to a YouTube super user or BuzzFeed and expecting them to make you advert. They're going to make something that is kind of halfway between what they would do and what you would do. And that, I think, is, you know, forgetting ROI or returns or anything like that is a scary thing for a brand to do. And it's, I mean, no one was ever fired really for like creating a TV ad that, you know, delivered on their brand promise, but putting your brand in somebody else's hand and letting someone, you know, tell your stories for you, I think people get a bit nervous about that, and we need to kind of help them on that journey. And yeah, you've got a really powerful example there where, you know, you are taking a brief from a brand and kind of saying that's not really what you want to do. And I think you can take brands on that journey, but they just need a bit of help sometimes.
Yeah, it can be a leap of faith. And we did a campaign in 2013 with Eurostar for the American audience, because we felt, you know, our audience largely US based, not really aware of this fantastic sort of service where you can just leap between two European capitals in 2.5 hours. So what we did, you know, we presented Eurostar through the eyes of an American photographer and blogger experiencing it for the first time. So it was really, I mean, when we talk about authentic content, that was the real deal. Here was this sort of quite a fairly high profile West Coast photographer and blogger who had never been to London, never been to Paris, and certainly not expected to have that experience where you sort of zip between the two without having to, you know, sort of check your baggage and get on a plane and put all your liquids in a little bag. So that was really well delivered, authentic content, which worked for Eurostar to, you know, to sort of remind Americans that if you're coming to London, you might as well go to Paris and all of that. So,
and I think actually the most effective way of doing it is often, or makes it easier to sort of sell in, is, yes, it requires sort of a brave client, but also the more you can get the editorial teams involved up front, I find it really kind of facilitates that whole process, because they know their audience and what their audience want better than anybody else. So once you've kind of acknowledged that, so I'm working with a brand at the moment on doing something with Fox in the US, looking at Simpsons and Modern Family, that are two of their properties, and working with their writers. And what we want to do very specifically is work with their writers, because they create content that has real cultural traction, that is really defining. So rather than us try to do that badly, or just certainly not quite as well, brilliant, let's access that talent base that produces that. And the client, we've been through it, again, it takes time and it is a step-by-step process, but because strategically we've identified that those are two brands and properties that fit our, you know, have real traction with the target audience, and in terms of their distribution on UK platforms, have real scope to expand and have long tail and all those kind of things, kind of know where we want to be, and getting access to the people who can talk so fluently about that audience and exactly the kind of content that they want, I think gives the client real surety that they are happy that what they will end up with is going to be something that has much more enduring appeal than something that just purely focused on their product message.
That's interesting. I mean, we've talked about a few brands in a few countries and examples like that. Are there any countries there in terms of, if from a global perspective, that are really kind of showing how content should be delivered and how it should be done, and the best kind of ways forward? Are there any brands that have really got it on a global level, who really kind of understand? I mean, you're obviously working with Mondelez and Cadbury.
Well, yeah, I'd say it's hard not to say the US, but the US is in so ways, especially compared to Europe, such an easy market to land content. Like, you have huge budgets, everyone kind of speaks the same language, and you know, you push out one big thing. A lot of the Mondelez US marketers will be like, look at this amazing content stuff we're doing, why aren't you doing that in Europe? And we're like, well, we speak 30 different languages, and you know, people have different local news channels and things like that. It becomes very hard fragmented, so a lot of the really best in class does come from the US, but I don't think that's because there are better minds or experts there. They have kind of a cleaner playing field. I think, I mean, being honest, I don't think anyone has absolutely cracked this, and there's no one partner who'd be like, oh my gosh, every time I go to them I get a great, you know, content proposition and we can run with it, which is kind of good news, I suppose, for everyone in this room, that, you know, there still is an opportunity to get ahead of the game and really do it. I suppose some people probably feel like you are doing that, and perhaps it's a question of how we make sure clients and agencies and things have visibility of that. You know, do we do we even, I don't even know half of what's out there, half the people I can approach. I certainly didn't know your team existed until today, so I'm not sure how much Cadbury will do with the Wall Street Journal either, but you never know. So yeah, I mean, there are some...
Wall Street Journal readers love chocolate.
Well, there you go, everyone loves chocolate, yeah. I think there
Match made in heaven already,
Yeah.
goodness, come on.
There are some unexpected people who are doing well in the space, kind of like, like YouTube, for instance, has done quite a good job of creating networks around like the super users on their platform. So this is, 15, 20-year-olds creating some of the best in the class content in the world. And I've actually been quite impressed. We spent some time with ITN, who have a network of reporters and cameramen and studios around the world making news. And a year or two ago, they twigged that actually we have a network of studios and reporters and people around the world, and half the time they're not doing anything. Couldn't they help make content for brands and things? So I think people are getting onto it, but there's still there's no one person I think has cracked it, or even one brand necessarily.
No, I think some brands like Lego come quite close. But again, it's easier for some brands because the nature of their products. But actually, again, you look at a Red Bull, Burberry. I think actually probably the thing that they've got in common is they're quite single-minded about what they are. But they're not too precious. So Lego will do lots of kind of partnerships, but they're quite, I suppose, selective about who they would partner with. And they're, again, it's the nature of their category, but they're pretty playful with that. And I think that's the other trick, is creating kind of experiences that have like multi-dimensions to them. So again, something that's got an interface. And actually that's a real parallel almost with, how can I draw the parallel between Lego and a business audience? However, in the sense of connecting people together. And I think that's something actually that certainly if you're looking at opinion leaders, and it can be quite a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but lonely at the top, in the sense that within your organisation, you've got lots of people who specialise in the same thing that you might produce, but actually that don't necessarily have your skill set. So by networking those people together, and you see some of the work that's been done actually by the likes of EY and what they've done with their kind of CFO council, where they're bringing that group together to all help to kind of share war stories, but then to develop content that then they can share, that can be shared more broadly with other people who obviously don't sit on the council. But I think, how you create broader experiences and learn from people who aren't in your category. I think that's the other thing is sometimes, and this was something that we used to get, and Jerry will have a wry smile at this, but always asked about, competitor analysis and what our direct competitor set are doing. You kind of go, well, if you only ever look to your competitor set and they're really unimaginative, you'll just pat yourselves on the back that you might be doing something a little bit better than the other unimaginative people around the table. So actually look at who are completely different spectrums, but who are really leading in that field. And actually, you can draw a line between what you can learn from a Lego or even a Disney in the way that they look at their broad assets and their partnerships and their licensing. And I think that sometimes just takes you out of a comfort zone and makes you reappraise things.
I think, and obviously our readership is the C-suite, but they also, as well as work, they also have lives. We think about how they travel, where they go, what they consume personally. It's, what is the flip side of that hard-working C-suite existence?
There isn't one.